I thank that lady for her speech, and to continue the debate, I call on the second speaker of the opposition to give his speech.
I'm going to do two things in my speech. I'm first going to talk about the idea of the nature and role of the state and how we think the state should intervene in these kinds of cases where an individual is going to do harm to themselves. We think that's an important issue. When they've just skated over it with no analysis at all, other than saying, well, usually when it's illegal, we ban things. But we think in these situations we should also ban them. And secondly, this is really fundamental, ladies and gentlemen. I want to talk about the social nature of anorexia and how, it's not, as they suggest, an individual thing where people just stay with themselves. It's a competitive thing where people discuss and talk about it all the time. That's what I'm going to actually going to do a third thing, which is talk about the internet specifically and why this is the best place and the most important place to regulate. So first, I'm going to do the nature and role of the state, ladies and gentlemen. Because the only analysis that they stood up and told you was, oh, in other situations we ban things because it's illegal to do them. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, that anorexia is not illegal. But if you are seriously anorexic, we section you. We put you into hospital because you have a mental illness and because you do serious self-harm to yourself, ladies and gentlemen. In some countries where suicide is illegal, and even some countries where suicide isn't illegal, no thank you, we still ban websites which encourage suicide. Why do we do this, ladies and gentlemen? Because we say the state does have a responsibility to prevent situations where people can harm themselves or do damage to themselves. Websites which encourage people, no thank you, to inflict serious damage to their own body, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's important as well. What analysis did they give you as to why that's not important? Like, we tell you anorexia is a serious issue. We tell you it's created in the social space. We tell you it's an issue which stays people for the whole of their lives, which has an incredibly high mortality rate, which causes people to die, ladies and gentlemen. What do they say? They say, well, this is somehow disanalogous to illegal acts. We say, fine, it's disanalogous to illegal acts, but it's still extremely problematic, ladies and gentlemen. And they have to tell, and thank you, they give us some serious analysis about why it's not the proper role of the state to intervene in these situations, ladies and gentlemen. We think when you can isolate the most pernicious area, where these websites, which are directly encouraging anorexia, which are glorifying a socially induced disease, which are causing people to become, more anorexic and more self-harming, ladies and gentlemen, we say that's of course the proper role of intervention in the state, and thank you, just like it would be with websites that glorify suicide. Okay. On to the second main area, the idea about how is this socially induced illness. What did they really tell you about this? They said, oh, if you go to these websites, you're already anorexic. We say that's incredibly simplistic, ladies and gentlemen. There are obviously gradations of anorexia. You could be on the cusp of anorexia. You could be, have a BMI of 17 or 18, or you could be very, very seriously anorexic. We say these websites are really problematic because you are one of those people on the margins. You may be already anorexic, but you're not beyond help. You're in a situation where, if you go to these websites and see people, you see, posts of women who are incredibly thin, devastatingly thin, and you think, that's what people find attractive. Look at this website. All these posts saying, oh, look how attractive that girl is, look how beautiful her, she's so thin. We say when you see that, you become more anorexic. And that's a huge problem, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. Then they gave you this very weird analysis about how these forums actually help people. There are two things to say here, ladies and gentlemen. We're not going to ban all forums for anorexia. Glorify anorexia. So if you have an exchange between doctors and medical professionals telling you how to avoid anorexia, obviously and we gave you a way of regulating that, a test, and the potential litigation. So we think that's very weird, ladies and gentlemen. And if they think, well, it's about forums, you can't really regulate forums, of course you can regulate forums. On a forum, if someone posts something which glorifies anorexia, you delete that post from the forum, and thank you. And if the website doesn't delete the post from the forum, we shut the website down, and thank you. That's obviously regulation. That is very, very good. The websites they want, the good ones, are still going to exist. We say, no, thank you. We say the websites that aren't going to exist, the ones that glorify and say anorexia is good, you should look really thin. That's the social standard that we encourage. And thank you. And then they finally said, this is the only way that psychiatrists can have any information about anorexia. That's insane, ladies and gentlemen. The idea that psychiatrists are just trawling through these, studying these little forums and saying, that's what anorexia is. Oh, we now understand the minds of these people. That's clearly not happening. They have huge psychological studies. There is a huge amount of data on anorexics. Anorexics do go to psychiatrists. There are huge groups of people that, meet together. There are cognitive therapy classes, for instance. Thank you. That's where we get the information. We engage directly with the state, not, thank you, on these kinds of websites. But we're saying this is the really fundamental thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that when they stand up and say, any kind of space where anorexics meet and we discuss anorexia is good, we say, no, those kinds of spaces are particularly bad, ladies and gentlemen. Because anorexia is a social disorder which is based on people talking to each other and bidding each other down in terms of their weight, ladies and gentlemen. We see this all the time. Friendships about how they're anorexic. And we've seen mother-daughter competition, I think you're saying, about anorexia. We say that's the really problematic thing in society, ladies and gentlemen. It's based on a competitiveness with the other. It's based on saying, this person's really thin. I want to be like that person, ladies and gentlemen. That's really problematic. So when you have a forum of people, all were completely anonymous, all were saying, this is really beautiful, this is what I really like, or this is a picture of me, and then everyone else being like, that person's really pretty. We see that social space of competitiveness is exactly the kind of thing that we want to try and restrict. Go.
Why is it okay for the state to tell you that you may not damage your health in the service of other ends that may be more important to you?
I don't really understand what you mean. Like that was just a confusing point. What we say is that we see in those situations, we say that in that particular social space, we say that's exactly where there's a problem. When people can get together and talk about anorexia, we say that's what we have to do. Finally, on the idea of why the internet, ladies and gentlemen, we say two things. Firstly, because they're going to stand up and they're going to say, well, I'm sure it's the rest of society, why the internet? I mean, when you look at all these images in magazines or on TV programs, etc., etc. We tell you a couple of things. We say the internet is the most pernicious because in some ways it's open access to everyone. So all kinds of people with no regulation can just get on the internet and say, oh, this is what I think. You can have the most slanderous and most disgusting things posted on the internet, ladies and gentlemen. That means there's a real free-for-all, and therefore the most pernicious examples of this kind of thing happen. Because it's the most pernicious examples, we say that's a good place to actually regulate. We also say, though, in a way it's the most regulatable because we can easily close down these websites, and there's no real problem there. They're closing down the most extreme kinds of websites. We say that's also valuable, because when you find the most extreme examples, you can easily close them down. Whereas, when it's a very subtle thing that happens through television programs, through film, through magazines, which is not direct encouragement of the same kind, we say because these are the most pernicious, the most dangerous examples, but also ones that we can isolate, the websites that are the most dangerous, the most problematic, the ones that announce themselves as being the most dangerous and the most problematic, ladies and gentlemen. We say that's a social space that we can regulate, but we say that's the way we need to do that. So firstly, because it is the proper role of the state to intervene in situations where people do damage themselves in a normative way, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, because anorexia is a social illness, and creating forums where people can discuss that is really problematic, ladies and gentlemen, especially when those are the most, the forums which are not medical individual, issues, but actually just competitive issues. And finally, because the internet is the appropriate place for this kind of policy, we urge you to